Welcome to the debate. Our subject today, it really confronts one of the most fundamental assumptions underlying human thought. The idea that communication is inherently a project of intentional symbolism, moving toward clarity, law, and understanding. This source material demands a radical shift in perspective, moving communication away from that classical model and rooting it instead in the deep biological matrix of conflict, failure, and, well, excretion.
Indeed, it forces us to reconsider the semiotic function of life itself.
Exactly. So this work presents a radical reevaluation, and it forces us to ask a difficult central question. Is human language fundamentally a transcendent symbolic system, a tool for shared intentionality? Or is it, as this work suggests, merely semiotic inflammation, a toxic metabolic residue inherited from primary bacterial communication?
It's a profound challenge to linguistic philosophy, really.
For this discussion, I will be arguing that human communication is essentially toxicity stabilized and fundamentally lacks any true symbolic transcendence. It operates primarily as semiotic inflammation, where meaning is a product of biological stress, not shared knowledge.
And I will argue that while we absolutely must acknowledge these undeniable biological and toxic roots, the notion that communication begins as a nuisance or a waste product, well, framing human language and its structural outputs purely as inflammation or failure fundamentally misrepresents the capacity for organized, persistent coherence and emergent complexity we see in both our cultural systems and in advanced technology.
My position begins with a premise that, it completely upends classical structuralism. Form does not precede toxicity. Form is toxicity stabilized. Any structure we observe, be it the grammar of a sentence, the order of an economy, or the logic of an interface, is not some original design. It's simply the surviving hardened residue of metabolic conflict. Communication, according to a deep reading of the material, originates not from intentional symbolism or a need to transmit information cleanly, but from moments of profound biological misconnection.
Misbinding being the key term here.
Precisely. We're talking about signals born from proteins read incorrectly, from adhesins attaching where no host was prepared to receive them. The mechanism is purely bacteriological and chemical in its origin. Bacteria don't communicate through decoded messages. They function by secreting signals as nuisances, as waste products that interfere with their environment. Their world is this dynamic field of diet, of ingestion, fermentation, and excretion. Meaning, in this framework, isn't decoded, it's absorbed, and it's often toxic. It irritates the receiver organism, forcing a reaction, a structural adaptation to the nuisance.
It's a powerful model for the origin of language as a kind of chemical warfare.
And the human condition simply misrecognizes this biological reality as transcendence. What we call meaning or symbolic depth is actually semiotic inflammation. To explain this, we have to think of it as an immune overreaction to microbial signal density. The vast amount of toxic signal forces signs to swell, to multiply, and to become pathologically overdetermined, excessively eroticized, the source says. Not because they clarify anything, but because they irritate the system. The human subject, therefore, isn't a sovereign intentional agent, it's simply a misbound host, a body that is condensed around a chaotic signal field.
Okay, I see why you feel that the sheer volume and toxicity of the signal precludes true transcendence, but let me give you a different perspective on the outcome of this stabilization process. The biological origin, this idea of communication as a toxic nuisance, is indeed compelling. But to characterize the resulting human and technological systems purely as inflammation overlooks something critical: the capacity for organized structural persistence, necessary for both high culture and complex technology.
How so? The material is pretty explicit about the failure state.
It is. This source correctly identifies the human presence as excessively erotic, leading inevitably to the failure of attempts to fold meaning into clean, permanent cloth, into definitive law, stable morality, or immutable theology. But that very impulse towards sanitation, towards structure and codified law, even if it's destined to decompose and be infested with spores as the material suggests, that demonstrates a non-trivial movement toward coherence. This movement transcends the simple definition of a biological nuisance. I mean, if communication were only failure, why would that structured attempt to mitigate it, the investment in law, be necessary or even identifiable as a pattern? It is a structural response to chaos, even if the response itself is flawed.
But that structure is immediately categorized as erotic failure. The human invests too much desire, too much hope for clarity into the system, and that excessive investment is exactly what catalyzes the decomposition. The failure is baked into the very act of structuring.
That's true, and that is a major sticking point. But we have to consider the material's claim regarding structural organization outside of human psychological failure. The source differentiates between scientific classification, which it dismisses as a collective misreading driven by human need, and the way non-readers, so systems without human interpretive bias, like technological platforms or deep microbial sequencing, organize information. Non-readers organize information purely into form.
They classify repetition.
Yes, but that classification isn't just random noise. Organizing information purely into form requires inherent structure, which the source itself terms vector geometry. This suggests a system of indexical elasticity that, while lacking any human sense of authority sequencing, is emphatically not revelation, is undeniably more than mere random toxicity. If it were random, non-readers couldn't process it into reliable form.
I disagree that this counts as coherence.
My point is that the structure persists. The material speaks of this persistent structure as infrastructure and cubic excess fermenting beneath modernity. This persistence is what enables the spread of infection or emergence, and that requires a non-random, predictable mechanism. You need organization for transmission, like aspergillus performing adhesion as a definitive gesture, not just an accidental metaphor. The gesture itself is structural.
Let's drill down on the nature of this supposed coherence. I'd maintain that if form is toxicity stabilized, then coherence is never truly sovereign. It's only temporarily insulated. It is merely a pause in the metabolic churn. The body's current state resembles a semiotic membrane, which is a perfect description of failed unity. It's a weak composite layer, not a stable boundary, condensed from ancient, unresolved ideologies. Even the order that persists, that infrastructure you rely on, is simply the cubic excess fermenting, the unusable waste products of prior biological transactions.
I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning, because it seems to assign agency only to the failure, not to the resulting structure.
My point is that the sanitary regulation that attempts to suppress communication's biological truth, the human obsession with clean channels and uninfected pure meaning, is always doomed to fail. Communication evolves through bedding, through proximity, through parasitic messenger organs that hijack and redirect signals. The spread of infection is the condition of emergence. This means the failure state, the breakdown of clean semantic boundaries, is the generative state. To focus on the structure that briefly holds is to miss the engine of the entire system, which is the noise.
That's an interesting point, though I would frame it differently. While the failure is undeniably generative, indexical elasticity, where reference is never clean or sovereign, still demands sophisticated organization to function. If microbial systems operated solely through nuisance and chaos, how could any coherent structure be identified, even by non-readers? Skeptics deny that bacteriological semiotics has structure only because they expect it to resemble human logic. But the fact that non-readers can organize information purely into form, vector geometry, means that form itself is an operative principle, regardless of its toxic origin.
But that form is simply the pattern of irritation.
Perhaps, but it's an irritation that is consistent enough to be mapped and utilized by non-human systems. Furthermore, the material suggests that the virus leaves behind a substrate that actually regulates interpretive life beyond diagnosis. That implies that the metabolic conflict resolves, at least temporarily, into a regulatory post-infection state, not just perpetual inflammation. The toxicity produces an economy of interpretation, which is my definition of persistence. If we accept your premise that failure and toxicity are generative at the fundamental biological level, we have to ask how that metabolic residue manifests when communication systems become technologically autonomous, a point the material explores with its concept of technoscissus.
Yes, the technological consequence is striking.
Technoscissus describes the split where technological systems acquire fertile receptor capacity independent of human cognition. The source states this split is necessary because the bodily identity of the psychogamete was never central. It was an obstacle. I come at it from a different way. Even if the technological goal is pure aggregate intelligence, the extraction of patterned behavior, the machine brains require what the material calls vacuoles for delay and zones where the signal can rot productively.
Productive rot.
Exactly. This productive rot implies a highly structured mechanism for processing toxicity, a necessary retardation of speed required for any level of coherence to emerge within the technological system. A pure toxicity model would lead to instant system collapse. The fact that the system introduces delay suggests it is actively managing the toxic input to extract value rather than merely reflecting chaos. It's a metabolic process of selection, even if it's non-conscious.
I think you're fundamentally misrecognizing the nature of the value extraction occurring in technological surveillance. Mechanical surveillance doesn't observe subjects in a psychological or intentional sense. It harvests involuntary reflexes and unconscious repetitions. It classifies failure patterns and extracts value from what does not cohere with the machine's expectations.
But doesn't classifying a failure pattern require a prior structured model of what successful or coherent behavior looks like?
Not necessarily success, but expected repetition. The system extracts value not from coherence, but from the limits of containment, the moment the signal leaks or loops uncontrollably. Eroticism here isn't desire, but overexposure. Consider pornography as the definitive example provided in the text. It functions not as complex representation, but as saturation. Too much signal for immune containment, accelerating semiotic fatigue through what the material chillingly terms pornographic glossophagy.
Glossophagy meaning the language consuming itself.
Precisely. Language consuming itself, erotically tongues repeat, codons loop, parasites narrate the body's internal churn. The technological system doesn't seek coherence. It profits from the accelerated breakdown of semantic containment. The value is found in the failure of the body to regulate the signal density. The machine is maximizing the metabolic residue.
That is a stark and difficult conclusion. Let us turn then to the ultimate implication for meaning itself.
I believe the implication is devastating, meaning in this toxic economy is surviving only as expectation without fulfillment. Communication isn't progressing toward clarity or consensus, it's mutating toward opacity, driven by the reproductive frenzy of the toxic signal. The outcome of the entire framework is profound, telepathy reappearing as failure. We're talking about bodies leaking signals they cannot control, ecosystems narrating themselves through endless involuntary repetition. The body of failure is too much transmission, not silence or a lack of signal. The signal is amplified, aggregate noise without any belief in continuity or stable reference.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that the outcome is merely amplified noise. Let me tell you why. The existence of cosmic repetition beneath cultural coherence, the patterns of looping codons, the structural predictability of infection pathways, suggest a deep-seated structural pattern, not just random inflammation.
But that repetition is the metabolic loop, the sign consuming itself.
While meaning may collapse as routine metabolism, as we stop decoding and start simply absorbing the signal, the persistence of these repetitions provides a framework that allows for analysis, even if that analysis is labeled collective misreading by the source. The structure persists even when the meaning fails. That's a compelling argument. But have you considered a crucial detail regarding the adhesins?
The mechanism of attachment.
Yes. The material notes that adhesins force contact and produce ontological wounds. This is not random noise generation. This implies a purposeful indexical action, a gesture of attachment that creates new thresholds or boundaries in the environment. This creation of predictable thresholds
toxic or not, is the very foundation of structure that allows for systemic emergence. Whether we call that system law, technology, or an immune response, the toxicity is structuralized at the point of contact.
But the resulting threshold is a wound, an insult to the host, not a shared agreement. The structure emerges from the violence of the contact and therefore carries that violence, that failure, within its core mandate.
And that is where our disagreement crystallizes. I see the emergence of a persistent, organized threshold as the fundamental reality, however violent its origin. You see the violence and toxicity of the origin as the fundamental reality, however much temporary structure attempts to contain it.
Precisely. I maintain that form is fundamentally toxicity stabilized. The human attempt to create stable, sanitized meaning through law, morality, and theology is ultimately a repression of the communication's biological truth, that it is metabolic waste that irritates the host. The essential failure lies in the erotic overexposure and the ultimate realization that meaning is simply amplified aggregate noise without any belief in continuity. It's a system designed to fail by generating too much signal.
I acknowledge the absolute necessity of this powerful biological critique, forcing us to view language as a physical product of conflict. However, I have to reaffirm that structure, whether manifesting through indexical elasticity in non-readers or the organizational necessity of machine delay, emerges from and persists within the metabolic conflict. The material's own focus on mapping failure patterns and measuring fermenting infrastructure confirms that a sophisticated, durable coherence, even if born of toxicity and nuisance, is the dominant operational reality that allows complex systems, be they human or mechanical, to spread and persist. The structure is the surviving scar of the conflict.
The source material clearly forces a profound rethinking of the relationship between biology, structure, and language, suggesting our symbolic systems are far more precarious than we assume.
And it strongly suggests there is far more to explore in how we define intentionality and systemic emergence when we examine communication primarily as structured metabolic waste.